Good evening, everybody. Hello. Good evening and welcome. My name is Eloise Knowlton, and I serve as the Associate Vice President for Academic Affairs here at Assumption University. My opaque title hides the fact that I am our study abroad advisor, and so it gives me great pleasure to gather with you tonight to celebrate 10 years of Assumption's award-winning Rome program. Thanks to the leadership of past Rome program director Patrick Corrigan, we have been marking this milestone in a variety of ways throughout the fall, including tonight's lecture. It is hard to believe that we have been bringing students to Rome for a full decade. As of even date, 376 students have experienced the Eternal City for a semester or a summer experience, living in Villino Dufaux and dining on Chef Monica's cuisine. 7 pioneering students flew out one cold February morning in 2013. And since then, the program has grown deeper and richer in so many ways. Those brave undergraduates arrived at a house that was not quite fully renovated for an experience that was still somewhat in the making. Since then, every director, every faculty in residence, and every student has made a mark on the program, and in turn, now bears the distinguishing mark of time spent in Rome. Could those who are former directors maybe stand? Patrick, Carrie, Richard, anybody else? Oh, Christian. Wonderful, thank you. Could those who have been faculty in residence please stand? I know Professor DiBiasio is here, Professor Lepin, Professor Geddert, Professor LeBlanc again. Wonderful. And how about students? Could the students who have, Lucas LaRoche, got a couple up here, Declan went. Wonderful. So Rome, that is where our speaker tonight is going to bring us. And no one could be better as a guide for this group because Father Richard Lamoureux is a local who studied abroad. Born and raised here in Worcester, he attended Assumption Preparatory School and Assumption College, graduating with the class of 1964. He joined the Assumptionists and traveled first to Belgium to study philosophy at Saint-Gérard, and then to Rome, where he earned a Bachelor of Sacred Theology at the Università Gregoriana. Further postgraduate work led to a Master's in Divinity from the Weston School of Theology, a Master's in Art History from Boston University, and a PhD in Art History from the Institute of Fine Arts in New York City. Father Lamoureux's administrative credentials are no less impressive than his academic ones. Here at Assumption, he has served in almost every capacity there is. As professor, as chair of the Department of Fine Arts, as the director of campus ministry, as associate dean, as provost, as vice president for mission, and as trustee. In 1984, he was elected superior of the North American province of the Augustinians of the Assumption, and in May 1999, he was chosen as the superior general of the order. As head of that global order, he was the 8th successor to the founder Emmanuel Dalzon, and he was only the 2nd American to hold the position. In this role, Father Lamoureux used his fluency in no fewer than 4 languages to provide leadership for over 120 communities in 30 locations worldwide. His scholarly interests abide at the intersection of art and faith and have been shared internationally in Manila, Louvain, Toronto, and elsewhere. He's the author of a monograph on the Church of San Sebastiano in Mantua. He has a special interest in the work of Michelangelo. His course on the sculpture is over-enrolled whenever it's offered. His current book project is Michelangelo on Love and Other Mysteries. Tonight, his talk is called Listening to Architecture, Michelangelo's Design for Rome's Capital. Please join me in welcoming Father Richard Lamoureux.
Thank you very much, Eloise. I'm happy to be able to speak on the occasion of the anniversary of our Rome program. It's a 10-year-old program, but it actually began about 15 years ago. I think Patrick brought groups to Florence and Rome in various capacities and venues, and eventually that developed into the Rome program on the property of the Assumptionists in Rome. So it's just a great program and a wonderful location. So sign up. So the title of my talk tonight, Listening to Architecture, Michelangelo's Design for Rome's Capital, probably needs a little bit of an explanation, though we'll be focusing on Michelangelo's design for Rome's capital. My title is a reminder that architecture shapes the way we act and live, and even think and feel. Much of the time we're very much unaware of the impact that it has on us. But architects understand that architecture speaks. It's clear from one of Michelangelo's sketches that for him, even a column base could speak. You see that? Pretty subtle. So tonight, listen carefully as we look at the work of a great architect. Second thought by way of introduction. Rome is an unusual city. Here, two cultures vie for our attention. The Christian culture, symbolized by St. Peter's and the churches on just about every block in the city, and the culture of pagan Rome, though in ruins, an ever-present reality, especially when you're trying to dig subway tunnels through ancient remains. Politically, though, these two cultures were finally allowed to coexist peacefully when in 313 AD, the Emperor Constantine allowed everyone, including Christians, quote, to follow the religion of their choice, unquote, and even started himself to build places of worship for the Christian community. Since that time, questions were regularly raised. What place should the church have in the life of the city? Is the city governed by the Pope, the church's head, or by its own autonomous rulers? I'm suggesting here that when Michelangelo set about designing Rome's capital, he was very much aware of these questions and attempted to provide some answers. So to understand those answers, it will be important for us to listen attentively to his architecture. I'd like to begin with a little bit of history about the Capitoline Hill and about Michelangelo's contribution to its development. Then I'll provide some elements of an analysis of his design. Most cities in Italy developed slowly around their ancient squares, like, for example, Montepulciano near Florence. I was just there this past summer, so it's still in my memory. So in these squares, the local cathedral, the city hall, the prince's palace, all of these major buildings clustered together around the center of the city, which then developed around that core. This was not the case in Rome. After the abdication of the last emperor in 476, the city gradually decayed. By the middle of the 6th century, the population had decreased from its high of about 1 million people to just 30,000. Gathering spaces and churches were mostly on the outskirts of the city, with the population settled in no order along the banks of the Tiber. If in ancient times the Forum had served as the central civic space for Rome, by the 10th century it had fallen into ruin and had become a cattle marketplace. And that's what you see in this 16th century painting of the Roman Forum, overrun by cows. In fact, it came to be called not the Forum, but the Campo Vaccino, the cow field. In the 12th century, all this began to change. In 1143, to be precise, on the occasion of a popular uprising against the Pope and the city's dominant noble families, a new local government, quote, desiring to renew the ancient dignity of the city, unquote, organized itself as a republic with a senator and a council, as well as a set of administrative officers, all to be housed on the Capitoline Hill. Though the smallest of the 7 hills of Rome, the Capitoline was chosen because in antiquity it had been the most sacred site in the city, visible to all who would frequent the Forum on a daily basis. The hill was made up of 3 parts. The highest point to the northeast was the site of a fortress and a temple to Juno, over which later in the 6th century a church was built, still standing today, the Araceli Church. The elevation to the southwest was the site of the most important temple in the city, dedicated to Jupiter. And then the saddle between the fortress and the temple of Jupiter was called the Asylum, or refuge, where legend says Romulus, one of the twins that founded Rome, harbored refugees coming from other cities. The story was told that when digging the foundations for the temple of Jupiter, a workman found an enormous human skull, caput, which was considered a sign of the city's future greatness. The skull gave the name Capitolium to the entire hill. We refer it today as the Capitoline Hill, or in Italian, the Campidoglio. Our own capital in Washington takes its name from this hill. Given the venerable history of the site, it's not surprising that Roman citizens in the 12th century should choose the Capitoline Hill as the ideal location for their own government center. They first constructed a modest building, then expanded it in the 13th century. This is a modern reconstruction of that 13th century building. The building housed a central body flanked by 2 towers of unequal height. A short ramp gave access to the ground floor space, open to the exterior by means of an arcade. It's from this area that the senator addressed people assembled in front of the building. A larger ramp gave direct access to the 2nd level with a more impressive set of arched openings. On this level, the senator held court and administered justice. The ramp then continued onto the top level of the building, where the senator received visitors in audience and had his own residence. The building provided an open and accessible space for the peaceful rule of the city, but the 2 corner crenellated towers, crenellation is that strange design up at the top of the towers. The two corner crenellated towers gave the structure a fortress-like appearance, a reminder of the threats against which the government might still be called upon to defend itself. After the return of the popes from Avignon in France in the late 14th century, Popes Martin V and Eugene IV had been eager to assert their authority in the city. However, their successor, Pope Nicholas V, sought instead to collaborate with communal authorities, while still being clear about the supremacy of the Church. He initiated a series of building projects in the city, and at the same time invested heavily in improvements on the Capitoline Hill. He began by walling up the arcade on the ground floor of the Senator's Palace and replaced the arcade on the second floor with a series of rectangular windows, thus clearly distinguishing the ground floor level and the second story used for more solemn functions. He also reinforced the fortress-like character of the building by adding two crenellated towers in the back, only one of which you can sort of see on the right. The fourth in the back is hidden. Next to the Senator's Palace, this is a drawing, by the way, of the 15th century, so it's a contemporary drawing. Next to the Senator's Palace, he built or rebuilt a second structure to house offices and meeting spaces for the guilds and later the conservatori, or elected city officials. Pope Nicholas had effectively established the boundaries of a piazza, a public gathering space where citizens could assemble and their government could work to establish order in the city. Admittedly, the two buildings and the space before them were hardly coherent, finished, and sophisticated architectural designs. Pope Nicholas also worked on other major projects in the city, building an impressive residence for himself at the Vatican, on the left of the screen, refurbishing St. Peter's, and altering the appearance of the Castel Sant'Angelo, which protected access to the Vatican. At the Castel Sant'Angelo, he added 4 corner towers. Up at the top, you see a 15th century drawing of the Castel, probably more or less accurate, but you can see the remnants of 4 towers. And on the right, the Castel Sant'Angelo with the remnants of the 4 corner towers around Castel Sant'Angelo. So he added these 4 corner towers, and he did so very deliberately to mirror those on the Senator's Palace on the Capitoline. Thus, the Pope visually linked the 2 poles of authority in the city. Just as the Senator's Palace on the Capitoline protected justice dispensed by the senator, so too did the Castel Sant'Angelo protect justice, but of a more spiritual nature, dispensed by the Pope. Now for a word about Michelangelo's contribution to this story. Around the time when Pope Nicholas was doing his work in the city, Michelangelo was born in Florence. He made his first visit to Rome when he was barely 20 years old. At that time, in just a few years in the city, he made a name for himself by carving the Pietà in St. Peter's. Pope Julius then, a few years later, invited him back to Rome to begin work on his own tomb and to paint the Sistine ceiling. Michelangelo finally returned to Rome in 1534, living at the foot of the Capitoline Hill and residing there until his death 30 years later. His arrival in the city coincided with the election of Pope Paul III. The Pope quickly put him to work as the chief architect, painter, and sculptor of the Vatican, with a first commission to paint the Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel. By this time, the artist's reputation in the city was well established, and on December 10th, 1537, he was made an honorary citizen of Rome in a ceremony held at the Church of the Araceli on the Capitoline Hill. Michelangelo had to have been impressed by the shabby appearance of the city's civic center. This is what it looked like from the Araceli. In fact, just a year earlier, in 1536, during a visit of the Emperor Charles V, the solemn welcoming procession that made its way through the city in the direction of the Vatican didn't even bother to climb to the top of the Capitoline. Instead, the senator and his cohort, clothed in Roman togas, greeted the emperor at the foot of the hill. All of this seemed to stir to action both city officials and the Pope himself. In 1537, funds were allocated to renew the site and a group named to oversee the project. Pope Paul himself decided to move to the Capitoline a life-sized bronze equestrian statue of the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, a 2nd century Roman emperor. He was the last of the so-called 5 good emperors, the Stoic philosopher himself, called protector of the Christians by the early Christian writer Tertullian. The ancient Roman bronze statue that the Pope moved had stood since at least the 10th century near the cathedral church of St. John Lateran, in front of what had been, at that time, the Pope's official residence in Rome. The statue had become one of the city's venerable and popular monuments, even though it was often misidentified, sometimes as the Christian Emperor Constantine, or at other times as a folk hero in Republican Rome, who had saved the city from a besieging enemy army. So the statue had become not only a symbol for law and good government, but also for Republican and Christian virtue. It was this statue, with all of its accumulated significance, that the Pope decided should be moved to the Capitoline. The Pope's determination and his selection of Michelangelo to design a new base for the statue suggests that he had an ambitious plan in mind for the Capitoline. Even Michelangelo's design for the base of the statue suggests that he was thinking more broadly about an overall design for the hill. The base made by Michelangelo was unusual, with a relatively low and small profile. The base succeeds in giving prominence to the figure it supports, making it readily accessible to viewers standing on the pavement below. It is rectangular on the ground and directly under the statue, but its 4 sides are convex. The unusual design reflects what Michelangelo probably had in mind for the layout of the piazza itself. That is, generally rectangular, but overlaid with an oval shape, which emphasizes the center where the statue is located and reinforces the longitudinal axis of the piazza. As soon as the statue was set up on its new base, Michelangelo began work on a new entrance to the senator's palace. He built a double ramp stairway to replace the original off-center ramp on the right side of the facade. Though located in the center of the palace, the new stairway obliges visitors to move to one side or the other in order to ascend to the second level. The stairway design will eventually provide the perfect setting for other ancient statues that had been moved to the square in the 15th century and been deposited in front of the second building on the site, but more about those statues in a moment. As Michelangelo continued to work remodeling the facade of the senator's palace, he turned his attention to the second building on the site, the so-called Palace of the Conservatori, here visible on the right of this drawing. Constructed in the 15th century, as mentioned earlier, this building housed the headquarters of the city's guilds and the offices that regulated commerce in the city. We'll see that Michelangelo's redesign of the Palace of the Conservatori would confer considerable dignity upon its commercial and popular political function. Guiding the artist in his work on these two buildings was an overall plan for the whole space on the hill. This is a 1560 drawing, presumably based on Michelangelo's own sketches and designs. He foresaw the construction of a third building on the left side of the piazza, which would eventually be called the New Palace, or Palazzo Nuovo. Today a museum, which, by the way, houses the Dying Gaul, a fine copy of which lives in the lobby of the Maison Française on our campus. He also foresaw a grand ramp called the Cordonata that would permit access to the piazza from the north. Finally, he foresaw an original design for the pavement of the square that would visually and symbolically tie all of these elements together. Michelangelo's work on the Capitoline began in 1538. When he died in 1564, the project was still not finished. For example, the new palace that he foresaw wasn't completed until 1654. Rather than take the time to review this complicated and somewhat boring building history, I'd like for us to visit this work together, at least by means of photos, as I provide some elements of analysis. As you climb the ramp up to the hill, the piazza just gradually reveals itself. We are leaving the city and moving into another realm set apart from the city. The architect has provided easy access from the city, but still we are being prepared for something very different. At the top of the ramp, you can see two statues, very big statues with horses next to them, depicting the Dioscuri, the two sons of Jupiter, whose temple, you will recall, once crowned the hill. The poet Dante thought of these two figures as defenders of liberty, symbols of popular resistance to tyranny. Michelangelo had planned to situate these two statues so that they would face each other. This is a little detail of the sketch you saw a couple slides ago. You can see the two statues are facing each other rather than facing outwards. They are there not to greet us as they do today, but rather to mark the boundary between the city that we are leaving and the space we are now entering. The ramp reminds me of the ascent to the Acropolis in Athens and the monumental gateway called the Propylaea, which, like the Dioscuri, ceremonially marks the transition from city to sacred space. And by the way, I did do a little research on this. It's very possible that Michelangelo would have seen drawings of the Acropolis in the 16th century. A lot of Italians traveled to Athens. I think Michelangelo was trying to make the Capitoline Hill into a space that would do for Rome what the Acropolis did for Athens, namely, to provide for its citizens an image of its glory as a great city, a republic of free people. Once we pass this boundary at the top of the ramp, we're confronted with three buildings united by a similar design. The two side buildings face each other at an oblique 80-degree angle, creating a trapezoidal space that widens as we advance, drawing us to the center of the square. This is especially clear in these aerial views. This view also makes it clear that it is the space we're in that was Michelangelo's principal concern. We usually think that an architect's job is to design buildings in which people can live, work, worship, recreate, etc. But here, Michelangelo has focused his attention not on the interiors of the buildings, but on their exterior appearance by providing new fronts to old structures. By means of these new facades, he could shape the space between the buildings, giving it a particular character and providing a dignified area in which the people of Rome could gather for important moments in the life of the city. Continuing our visit, we move forward, and our attention is first drawn to the equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius. As I said, a symbol for Romans of law and good government, of republican and Christian virtue. The statue is located in the very center of the space. By the way, paradoxically pointing in the direction from which we just came, but more about that paradox later. We then move to one side or the other of the statue as we go forward. The radiating pavement design reinforces this centrifugal movement. Our attention now is focused on the most important building of the whole square, the Senator's Palace. Interestingly enough, Michelangelo did not foresee a monumental staircase perpendicular to and in the center of the building, which would naturally invite us to climb the steps and enter into the building, right? As I've said, he was less focused on what went on inside the building than he was on the activity in the square. Consequently, he built a double ramp staircase with access from the sides, effectively de-emphasizing the stairs and providing a flat triangular space for the display of statues, which would have been an important consideration for a sculptor. These statues include two reclining river gods, which had been on the Capitoline since the 15th century, but were moved to this spot by Michelangelo. One, supported by a sphinx, depicts the Nile. The other depicts the Tiber, therefore Rome, shown here with a wolf suckling Romulus and Remus, the city's legendary founders. Between the river gods, in a small niche, there is today a statue of Minerva, a personification of the goddess Rome. Michelangelo, though, had originally put a statue of Jupiter in the niche. I sort of recreated the thing. Again, to recall the temple of Jupiter that had once been on the summit of the hill. Thus, with three statues, Michelangelo has conjured up the geographical extent of the ancient world, Egypt, Italy, Rome, as well as ancient Rome's principal deity. Together, they recall the triangular pediments on the front and backs of ancient temples. This is a reconstruction of the Parthenon in Athens, which always included the god's image in the center and river gods at the extremities to identify the topographical features of the place where the temple was located. Directly above the statue of Jupiter is the main entrance to the palace. Michelangelo foresaw that a baldachin would be constructed on this landing, but it was never built. It is shown here in the drawing we saw earlier, and in a reconstruction. It is under this baldachin, which, if you visited enough churches in Rome, evokes the sort of architectural feature most usually found in churches, or like the one at the Pope's residence at St. John Lateran, where the statue of Marcus Aurelius used to be located. And it's in these baldachins that the head of government would appear on formal occasions, such as the conferral of honorary citizenship or on eminent visitors to the city. In such a setting, events like these bore not only civic, but quasi-religious significance. So Michelangelo succeeded in providing Rome with a space in which its citizens could assemble in a dignified manner. But beyond meeting this practical need, he was also reminding the city of the particular ideal that defined the political community that gathered there. Let's see what else he might be saying to us about this shared ideal. That Michelangelo wanted to give this outdoor space a character that recalls ancient Rome is clear. He did this by the sculpture that figures so prominently in the square, but also by his design for the facades of the three buildings. Their main feature is the classical orders that he would have copied from the ruins in the Forum just below the Capitoline. He replaced the original series of medieval-looking arches on the Conservatori Palace with a more classical post and lintel system, vertical and horizontal elements. For the ground level of the palace, where business offices were located, he chose what is considered the subordinate Ionic order on short, slender columns. The Corinthian order, however, is then used for the colossal pilasters that rise to the top of the buildings, where the more important political functions and formal gatherings were located. These colossal pilasters, which lend an especially monumental and dignified character to the civic function of these buildings, will reappear in just a few years on Michelangelo's design for St. Peter's at the other end of the city. By imitating and adapting elements of classical architecture, he has suggested that the Rome of his day shares in the history and genius of its ancient predecessor. But there's more. When in the 12th century, Rome decided to erect a building to house its local government, it chose to do that, as we have seen, on a hill that held considerable significance for ancient pagan Rome. But rather than make its structure face the remains of the Roman Forum and Colosseum to the south, city officials oriented their building away from the Forum toward the developing city to the north, an area known as the Campo Marzo, officially not part of the ancient city of Rome. You will recall that Pope Nicholas V gave similar features to the Senator's Palace on the Capitoline and to the Castel Sant'Angelo near his residence at the Vatican in order to relate these two poles of authority. In designing the Capitoline, Michelangelo was not unaware of this turn to the north. Upon entering the square, the visitor's gaze is at first directed to the south, where tucked into the right and left sides of the Senator's Palace, there are two small flights of stairs that discreetly lead one to a view of the Roman Forum behind. But turned around to the north, with Marcus Aurelius pointing in that direction, the visitor has a broad view of the city and even the dome of St. Peter's in the distance. To encourage this orientation to the north, the visitor is given easy access to the city, descending not on stairs, but on a ramp designed to look like flowing water, which seems to facilitate and accelerate the downward movement of the visitor. And you've experienced this if you've ever walked down the ramp. This reorientation of the Capitoline toward Christian Rome was, I believe, intentional. On two tablets alongside the portal into the Palace of the Conservatori, these are the two tablets, we read, on one, SPQR, Senatus Populusque Romanus, imitating as far as possible its ancestors in spirit and deed, restored the Capitoline, decayed by the ravages of time, the year 2320. You get that? 2320. Rome was founded in 783 BC, so that, if you do the math, it adds up to 1567 AD. And then on the other tablet, SPQR, the Capitolium, once principally dedicated to Jove, that is Jupiter, is now consigned to the true God, Jesus Christ, the author of all good things, in the year 1568 from the beginning of salvation. These tablets were put in place 4 years after Michelangelo died, but probably during the time when we know his close friend, Tommaso Cavalieri, whose name was inscribed on the first tablet, himself an artist and architect, was putting the final touches on Michelangelo's design. We can be confident that the inscriptions reflect the artist's thinking. In many ways, therefore, while retaining its Roman character, the Campidoglio is given a new orientation and an additional Christian meaning. One last observation. When approaching the Marcus Aurelius statue, the sensitive visitor will notice that the pavement rises as well. It's not flat, but it's a mound. It's convex. The architect, you can probably see that a little bit in this picture. Take my word for it. The architect designed the pavement to be not flat, but slightly convex. That he intended for it to be a raised surface is clear from his original plan. You'll notice that he foresaw steps opposite the entrance ramp by which the visitor would walk up to the mound, and steps at the other end by which one would descend the mound and approach the stairs to the senator's palace. Such a design could not have been justified for practical reasons. On the contrary, an entirely flat surface would have been much easier to construct. And on this curved surface, Michelangelo inscribed an unusual 12-pointed star-like pattern. We know that the cupolas of ancient Roman buildings, pagan Roman buildings, were frequently decorated with 12 compartments, recalling the 12 signs of the zodiac, thus suggesting the dome of heaven. In the domes of Christian buildings, then, the zodiac is replaced by the 12 apostles, surrounding the central figure of Christ. But what did Michelangelo have in mind by including elements like these in his design? The informed 16th century visitor to the Capitoline would have been very much aware of the tradition, repeated in medieval guidebooks to Rome, that the hill was considered to be the caput totius mundi, or head of the whole world. They also knew that in the ancient Roman Forum, one spot was traditionally identified as the umbilicus urbis Romae, or the navel of the city of Rome, the symbolic center of the city from which all distances in ancient Rome were measured. The spot, located just below the Capitoline Hill, can still be seen today. In giving the Capitoline Square the form of a mound, could Michelangelo be suggesting that it is a segment of the terrestrial globe on which the signs of the zodiac appear? His square, then, becomes not simply the headquarters for government offices or the gathering place for the people of Rome, but it takes on cosmic or universal significance as the caput mundi, the navel of the entire world, the new center from which all distances in the world should now be measured. This new reality, an image of which I believe Michelangelo has given us in his design for the Capitol, integrates both the pagan and Christian worlds. And he's proposing this new Rome where the political and philosophical genius of ancient Rome and Greece works in harmony with the genius of the world of faith as a model for the whole world, speaking to people of all times and places, even to us in 21st century America. If I've convinced you of nothing else, I hope now you will understand that architecture speaks, and that it speaks volumes. That in his design for Rome's capital, Michelangelo, a poet as much as an architect, sculptor, and painter, has conjured up a multitude of images and ideas that invite us to reflect more deeply on the importance of sacred civic spaces and on the relationship between ancient Rome and the Christian order. I'm sure the skeptics among you will ask, could Michelangelo have been thinking about all of this? After all, he was only an artist. Well, this artist read the Bible assiduously, learned about Plato from scholars when he was living in the Medici household, knew Dante by heart, and studied Augustine's City of God as he prepared to paint the Sistine ceiling. What we've been able to see tonight, I hope, in his design for the Capitoline Square is no doubt just a small part of what this genial artist put into it. I invite you to continue listening to Michelangelo as he speaks to you in his art. Thank you very much. We do have a few minutes for questions. Anybody would like to ask a question? You get extra credit if you ask a good question. Dr. Lepin said he would give you extra credit.
I want to comment that the mayor of Rome met Assumption students right at the base of those stairs.
Really?
Yes.
Not from up above under the baldachin. Good for him. Yeah, that's where the mayor currently has his office, or her office. It's a woman, I think, isn't it? No. Yeah. So still functions as an official place for ceremonies, and I had some pictures of brass bands celebrating some holiday or something. So still used for those kinds of events.
I'm struck. You often seem to me to blur this civic and sacred in this space, and I'm just struck. I was struck by this, especially in the analogy that you were making with the in Athens.
The Acropolis.
The Acropolis. So what's peculiar is that, as you were very clear, as you go up the ramp, you are, in a sense, leaving the city, and yet you're not leaving it to enter a sacred space, unlike the Acropolis, where you really are, you're leaving the city, entering into a sacred space. This is, and this is the strange thing to me, and I don't know, you're sort of leaving the city to enter the city space. In some kind of special, this is a very special, but still civic, not sacral space.
Yeah, that's interesting. You're right. We are leaving the city, but we're entering into a civic space, a space at the service of the city. But I think it's a space that is raised to another level. I think it's meant to be an ideal space, not the space of politics as usual, but a space where the city celebrates its identity, So it's in that sense, I think, that it becomes, not simply a political space, but a sacred space. And I think the architect wanted to suggest that in various ways, That being said, unlike the Acropolis, which has a temple at the summit, this doesn't have a temple at the summit. It has the senator's office, in front of which is a pediment that makes it look like a temple.
But I think that notion of somehow, some idealized city,
Yeah.
might that might fit.
Yeah.
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 I mean, because the arithmetic that's got to be going on with this design is it's certainly beyond me, but.
Yeah, I didn't get into this problem, but the Conservatory Palace here on the right pre-existed, and Michelangelo could have destroyed it, but he instead chose to enhance it, which means he accepted the fact that this building would not be perpendicular to the senator's palace. And the result would be that the two buildings are oblique. They're at an oblique angle to create a trapezoid. So he accepted that. One thing it does is it funnels your vision, as does a funnel, both in and out. And the ramp is shaped the same way. And the two major pathways traced in the forum are shaped the same way. So he accepted this constraint, and I think used it to some advantage that I'm not sure I understand fully why, but architects sometimes have to accept these constraints, and I think you'll agree it looks pretty good.
I'm intrigued by your notion of the caput mundi in the convex design of the center, but I'm also bothered by it, because what could that mean, or what could Michelangelo conceive that to mean in the 16th century? We're no longer in the days of the Roman Empire, when clearly Rome was caput mundi, but we've got France and England and Spain and German lands as powers that are rising in Europe at that time, and certainly not Italy at that time. So what does it mean for Michelangelo here to conceive of Rome as caput mundi, if that's what he's doing?
Yeah. Look, and maybe that's related to what Dr. Corrigan, the question Dr. Corrigan asked. Is Michelangelo simply speaking politically in terms of states, or is he speaking about another order that is one level removed, a higher order in which, the universal church, the world of the human world, that's the level at which he might be thinking, rather than any kind of political.
A church and a culture, not political.
Exactly. That's my thought. Yeah.
Comment and then questions for you. I've always found it fascinating going into the Capitoline museums, and I've always wondered what Michelangelo, knowing what his involvement was, is you go through the museums and then you make it down to the tabularium and you have that extraordinary overlook of the forum. And I'd always wondered the degree to which Michelangelo had that in mind. He was more interested in the facades of buildings were there, but maintaining that structure that was built and very much fortified into this very important ancient setting. That's just a comment.
And just if I can build on that for a second.
Yes.
I think he was. Why did he foresee the stairs right here and right here, unless he wanted people to have access to it? He didn't emphasize that access, but he wanted people to have access to it because it was important. So I think the ancient, the the ruins in back were important to him, but they weren't the primary emphasis. The primary emphasis was in the opposite direction.
Thanks. And the second part is, I think that you're entirely correct in saying, highlighting the genius of Michelangelo, who was a poet, who was a painter. Many of us know him, think of him simply as a painter, and think of the Sistine Chapel. He always considered himself primarily a sculptor, though. But architecture plays a very important role. In fact, if you look closely at the Sistine Chapel, the frescoes, not necessarily the Last Judgment, but it is architecture. There are figures that are built into this architecture. And if you look at his sculpture, for example, the tomb of Julius II, it is architecture.
Yeah.
And also the Biblioteca Laurenziana, it is an extraordinary system that he puts together. I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yeah, Michelangelo turned to architecture, especially towards the end of his life. You know, he lived till 89 years old, but already when he was around 60, his physical abilities began to diminish. Architecture a little bit easier than sculpture, you know. So he turned to architecture more. But you're right, from the very beginning, he had this spatial sense that he always took into account. So his statues, for example, always take into account the point of view from which people are looking at them. Even the Pietà can only be understood if you approach it from Mary's left hand. You have to approach it from a certain direction. So he was very conscious of space, even in his early career. When he finally does the Medici Chapel in Florence, there he was really designing a work of architecture. He put the sculpture on the walls, and the whole building becomes the work of art. You know, it's the space that is important there. The space on the floor, where the characters almost visually talk to each other, and the space vertically up to the cupola. So it's a spatial thing. So I think it's from that point on where architecture becomes his primary focus until the end of his life. So, okay.
I've often wondered why Mary's right hand looks so large compared to her left. Is that because I've primarily seen it front on?
The Pietà, you mean? Yeah. Well, her right hand is splayed open like this, so it does look very, very big, and she's supporting Christ under his right armpit, and her other hand is kind of curled up, pointing in that direction. So the way they're postured, I think, might give you that impression that one is large and one is small. But I think I've never noticed that they are actually physically different. And
I've looked at it very carefully on a number of occasions and come away with the idea that it is larger.
next time I see it, I'll try to measure it. Although you can't get very close. And yes, whoops.
Fascinating talk, as always, Richard. I've got a very tiny point to make, and that is that my experience with Michelangelo's work is that it's very spatial and in 3D always. And the point that struck me was your contention that the 12-pointed star is the omphalos. And as soon as you said that, I thought, well, I never noticed that the piazza rises in the middle. It bellies up.
Belly's up.
And you can't see it except in the photograph you showed, but belly buttons are in the middle of a belly. And so that just opened that up for me in an interesting way.
It is weird.
Yeah. And you
It's
don't
weird.
feel it when, I mean, I don't know, I wouldn't have noticed it until you pointed it out.
Jeremy.
So I was very impressed with the way that you described the way that statues under the steps there mirror the Parthenon in Athens. And it really helps to bring your argument together. So let me push against it a little bit. You're talking about how this is emphasizing the Republican nature of Rome. Could it be argued that if he truly wanted to emphasize the republican nature of Rome, that either he would have the stairs prominent in the front, kind of inviting people as they're ascending to continue that ascent to the place where Rome is governed, or even more so, perhaps, to open up that bottom floor the way that it originally was, so that you don't even need steps, so that it's inviting the people of Rome, the Roman Republic famously being SPQR, the Senate and the people. Would that be a more prominent way to emphasize the people of Rome?
Yeah. So that the question, this is a very interesting question, just how Republican is the Campidoglio? And how Republican was Michelangelo? Republican, that you know what I mean by Republican. And I don't have an answer to that question. It's very clear the architecture does have a monumental and even imperial character. These giant pilasters, those are not modest structures. They're really kind of very impressive. And so the effect, and then eventually St. Peter's, the effect of that kind of architecture is not simply democratic. Don't know what to say. It's a good question, and I don't. But part of the problem is I'm not too sure how political Michelangelo was. Finally, I don't think he was primarily concerned with politics. I think he was concerned with the way people organize themselves in the city, the way they relate to each other in the city. He was concerned with, but ultimately, I think his concerns were very different.
Richard.
Yeah, yes. Yeah.
Did Michelangelo see any relationship between the Campidoglio and the Araceli to the left?
It's an interesting question. The Araceli was there all the time, but no, I don't think so. I mean, he knew it very well. The Araceli was originally the sort of government center. That's where, before the Campidoglio was developed, from the 6th century on, any official events that took place in the city took place in the Araceli. So it was an important place. But the only link he made was, I don't know if you can see them. Right here. He didn't build these, but he foresaw stairs that lead up to the Araceli. So you could get access to it from the square. But I think he just blocked it out. I don't think he was concerned with it at all in the design, except for that little detail. Okay.